What I want to do in this lesson is start to talk about some of the principles that belie the theory of behaviorism. I want to talk in this lesson about the concept of classical conditioning, and then in the next lesson I want to talk about operant conditioning, which is a variation of the concepts of conditioning, and then we'll talk about expansions relating to behaviorism, so ways in which other theories like social learning theory has been able to expand upon some of the key fundamental ideas within behaviorism. So when we're talking about the concept of classical conditioning, we have to be talking about the experiments done by Ivan Pavlov in the 1900s, and this was a series of experiments, a series of studies conducted in the behavior of dogs. Now, this is probably a very popular, popular series of experiments. Most people understand the concepts of Pavlov's dogs and the Pavlovian conditioning. This is where it comes from. What Pavlov wanted to do was study how the dogs' salivation helped with food digestion. So really, his original study was actually had very little to do with the concepts he eventually will discover. So he wants to talk about the ways in which salivation relates to digestion. But in reality, he came across a number of key principles that we will then begin to describe as classical conditioning. He found that sometimes the dogs would salivate before even being given the food. And this is where the key concepts derive from. So, in seeing that, in noticing that the dogs salivate before being given the food, Pavlov wanted to study how the dogs can be conditioned to salivate. And this is what we know and we call Pavlovian conditioning. And we've got a very zoomed in example of this is one of Pavlov's dogs. And the concept of Pavlovian conditioning and the experiment he will subsequently do involved giving the dogs some food. This is the first thing that he would do. And at the same time as giving the dog some food, he would also ring a bell. So at the time of the dog getting some food, he would ring a bell. And then he would repeat this procedure. So what's important to note is that repetition is important. So repetition, if I can spell correctly. So after repeating this procedure a number of times, Pavlov would be then able to ring the bell without giving the dog any food. And at that point, even though the dog is not being given any food, the principal cause of the dog to salivate, Pavlov would instead just ring the bell. At that point, the dog would salivate without the food. He would just need the bell. And we can derive a number of things from this. So there are a number of different things that we can look at from classical conditioning. So there are a number of stages that we involve here. So there are a number of stages through the process of conditioning. This is the process of classical conditioning. So classical conditioning. That's what's important to note. So the first one is that Pavlov noticed that a natural stimuli or a natural stimulus would yield a natural response. And this is something that we need to note when it comes to classical conditioning. It requires there be a natural stimulus that yields a natural response. In the case here, the natural stimulus, so let's just put this up here, we'll put NS for natural stimulus. The natural stimulus is just the food. And the natural response, NR, is the salivating. Is the dog salivating? This is what dogs do. They salivate when they see that they're being given some food, because they with the intention of eating the food. And what we can also note is that we will call these things, I've written here natural stimulus and natural response, but in reality, in psychology, we call this a unconditioned stimulus. Okay? This is an unconditioned stimulus, the food. And this is because it hasn't required there to be any kind of conditioning imposed upon the dogs for the response. So the unconditioned stimulus is the food, is the same as the natural stimulus. They're the same thing. Equally, the salivation, the natural response, can also be described as the unconditioned response. So we have an example of the unconditioned stimulus, the US, and the unconditioned response, the UR. And these are the food and the salivation, just like the natural stimulus and natural response. Because they are unconditioned, they can be described as natural. Now, what we do here is Pavlov then introduces a new stimuli. They introduce a bell. And this represents a neutral stimulus. This represents a neutral stimulus. And what they do is they represent the neutral stimulus. They introduce the neutral stimulus at the same time as the unconditioned stimulus. Okay? So we have here the neutral stimulus. The neutral stimulus plus the unconditioned stimulus, and because we have an unconditioned stimulus here, the food, we will get an unconditioned response. So unconditioned response, like so. And in this example, the natural stimulus, this refers to the bell. The unconditioned stimulus refers to the food. And the unconditioned response refers to the salivation. Simple as that. This is what we have. And then after a period of repetition, so after a period of repetition, okay, this is done a number of times, where we combine this neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus to yield an unconditioned response. We combine the bell with the food to get the salivation. After a period of repetition, after this is repeated, we then have the unconditioned stimulus removed from the equation. Okay, so we then just keep the neutral stimulus, we just keep the bell. And what we find is that the bell, the neutral stimulus, has become an unconditioned stimulus. Sorry, has become what we call a conditioned stimulus, because we have now conditioned the dog to respond to the bell in the ways in which they responded to the food. And these two things here will then yield a conditioned response. So we get a conditioned response, the salivation. So let's draw this down here. So just like before, except what we're doing is we are removing this unconditioned stimulus, we're removing the food, and we are now replacing the neutral stimulus. The bell is now no longer a neutral stimulus, it is now the conditioned stimulus. So now we end up, after a period of time, after repetition, we have the conditioned stimulus, and this equals the conditioned response. And the conditioned response is the same as the unconditioned response. We yield the same result, and we get a conditioned response. Conditioned response. And just so we're clear, what the conditioned stimulus is the bell, and the conditioned response is the salivation. And now we're done. We have done with this experiment. We have used classical conditioning to condition a dog to salivate at the response of a bell being rung. And what we've done to do that is we've combined the neutral stimulus, the bell being rung, with an unconditioned stimulus, something that we know already causes a dog to salivate, for example, food. We get ourselves an unconditioned response because the dog is just responding to the food. The dog then becomes conditioned in a way that allows it to salivate at the hearing of the bell being rung. because it thinks that because a bell is being rung, it is assuming that there is also food around too, and therefore it salivates. And so we have conditioned it to the point where now if we only ring the bell, we don't even introduce the food, we just ring the bell, the dog will have a conditioned response, which will be to salivate. Let me come down here. So there are a number of principles that happens when we are talking about classical conditioning. So what are the principles? What are the number of processes that are required? Well, when a stimuli original to the conditioned stimuli produces a conditioned response, we call this generalization. So this is the first principle, the principle of generalization. Okay. So we have a stimuli that is original to the conditioned stimuli producers. The second principle is when a stimuli that is similar to the original conditioned stimuli doesn't produce a conditioned response, we call this discrimination. The third principle, when a conditioned response isn't produced as a response of the conditioned stimuli, we call this extinction. And then finally, what happens here is when we say have the conditioned stimulus, for example, the ringing of the bell, and this is repeatedly presented without the unconditioned stimuli, food, then this is an example of extinction. Okay? Eventually, if we keep on ringing the bell and ringing the bell and ringing the bell, eventually the unconditioned response tends to dissipate. We don't see the we don't see the conditioned response anymore. That's because the dog is expecting an unconditioned stimuli, the food, but it is not presented with that every single time. So this is the basic principle of classical conditioning. In the next lesson, we're going to expand upon the concept of conditioning and talk about the other kind of conditioning that we have, which is known as operant conditioning.